The emerald silk of Princess Elara's wedding veil snagged on the rough bark of the training yard post. She heard a tiny asterisk re-up asterisk, a sound like a sigh, as her father's voice boomed across the sun-baked square. He was announcing her betrothal to Crown Prince Kael of the Northern Reach, and each torn thread of that beautiful, expensive fabric seemed to whisper asterisk fraud star. This was the 10th of September, year 843 of the Southern Sun, a date that was supposed to mark a new beginning. To the crowd of 5,000 citizens packing the royal plaza of Aurelia, it looked like a scene from a storybook. To Elara, standing stiffly on the raised dais, it felt like a slow surrender. She could smell the sweet, sticky smoke from the peace incense burners, sandalwood and honey. But underneath it, carried on the warm breeze, was the scent of oiled leather and cold metal. That was the smell of the northern delegation, 200 of them standing rigid and watchful to her right. Their armor wasn't the polished gold of her father's guards. It was brushed steel, the color of a winter sky. She kept her eyes forward, her chin high, just as her etiquette mistress, Lady Constance, had drilled into her for 19 years. A princess is a statue of grace, she'd say. Today, Elara felt carved from stone. Her betrothed, Prince Kael, stepped up to the dais. He was 23, a year older than her, with hair the color of dark wheat and eyes that matched the grey granite of his homeland's mountains. He didn't smile. He simply gave a short, respectful nod first to her father, King Aldrich, and then to her. The movement made the simple silver circlet on his brow catch the sun. As he turned to face the crowd, his shoulder brushed against the ripped part of a veil. It wasn't an apology, just an accident of space. A heat that had nothing to do with the midday sun climbed up Elara's neck. Hidden in the folds of her extravagant gown, a gown of ivory satin and seed pearls that took 12 seamstresses 6 weeks to make, her right hand clenched. Inside that fist was a small, rolled parchment, the Treaty of Aurelia. The words on it promised an end to a 30-year war that had bled both kingdoms dry. Her father had pressed it into her hand that morning. "This is your purpose now, my dove," he'd said, his own eyes tired. As Kael's profile remained stern and unreadable, her nails, painted with crushed moonflowers, dug into the parchment. She pressed so hard she felt the wax seal crack. King Aldrich, a bear of a man now slightly stooped, raised his arms. His voice, still powerful, echoed off the sandstone walls of the palace. "People of the South, people of the North, today, we weave 2 bloodlines into one future. Let the past be buried, and a new day dawn." A cheer went up. It was loud, but it came in waves, first from the Southerners directly in front, then, after a beat, from the Northerners. It was a polite sound, not a joyful one. Elara made herself breathe in through her nose, counting to 4. She could feel the weight of her own crown, the gold sun diadem, which felt less like an honor and more like a chain. That's when she heard it. A different sound, sharp and mechanical, cutting through the fading applause. Asterisk twang dot asterisk. It was the sound of a crossbow releasing. Time didn't slow down, it fractured. The world became a series of flashes. A blur of motion from the crowd near the marble fountain. A gasp that swept like a wave. The sight of a black-fletched arrow cutting through the air, not towards her father, but straight for Prince Kael's heart. He didn't flinch. He didn't even see it. Elara's body moved before her mind could catch up. It wasn't bravery. It was pure, startled reflex. She stumbled back a half step, her heel catching on the hem of her gown. The arrow missed Kael by a hand's width and sank into the old oak training post right behind them with a sickening asterisk thud star. The impact vibrated through the wood. A shower of pale splinters sprayed against the side of Elara's face, stinging like angry bees. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence for 3 whole heartbeats. Then chaos erupted. Southern guards in gold cloaks surged toward the source of the shot. Northern soldiers drew their swords, forming a tight, bristling circle around Kael, their backs to him, their faces like shields. Elara stood frozen between the 2 rings of steel, the splinters burning on her cheek. She touched her fingers to the spot and they came away clean. No blood. Just shock. Slowly, Prince Kael turned his head. He looked at the arrow, buried a full inch into the solid oak. Then he turned his grey eyes to her. He looked at the torn veil, at the specks of wood on her skin, at her wide, unblinking eyes. He leaned in, so close she could see a faint scar along his jawline she hadn't noticed before. His voice was so low only she could hear it, calm and flat as a frozen lake. "Welcome to the Union." Before she could process the ice in those words, the guards were dragging a man through the crowd. He was struggling, a middle-aged southern farmer by his rough-spun tunic. As they passed the base of the dais, the man's sleeve ripped. And there, on his wrist, Elara saw it, the brand. A small, faded symbol of a climbing vine. It was the mark given to the veterans of her father's personal regiment, the Sun Wardens. Men who had fought the North for decades. Her eyes snapped from the brand to Kael's face. He was watching the man being hauled away, his expression unreadable. But in that moment, Elara didn't see anger, or fear, or even surprise. She saw something else. Something that looked like confirmation. The ceremony was rushed to a conclusion. The rest of the vows were spoken into a tense, murmuring atmosphere. The scent of the expensive peace incense was completely gone now, overpowered by the smell of dust, sweat, and fear. It hadn't even burned for the full hour it was supposed to. The formal procession back into the palace felt like a march to a dungeon. Elara's legs moved automatically. She could feel the eyes of the city on her, 1,000 unspoken questions pressing down on the heavy crown. That evening, the grand hall was filled with a feast meant to feed 1,000. Roast pheasant with berry glaze, towers of spice cakes, rivers of wine from the southern valleys. Music played, but it sounded thin and desperate. Elara sat at the high table between her father and her new husband. She didn't taste a single bite of the honey-glazed carrot that rested, untouched, on her golden plate. She watched the room. She saw her uncle, Lord Orwyn, laughing too loudly with a northern general. She saw Lady Constance dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She saw the way the northern delegates watched the southern servers, their hands never far from the belts. And she saw Kael. He spoke when spoken to, nodded, drank from his goblet. But his eyes were always moving, scanning, noting. He was a map of a battlefield in a room full of pretend peace. When the final toast was made, Elara was led by a procession of silent handmaidens to the marital chambers. The rooms were the finest in the palace, prepared for this night. Vases overflowed with midnight roses. A fire crackled in the huge hearth, pushing back the chill of the autumn night. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. She was alone. For the first time since the arrow flew, she was truly alone. Her knees didn't buckle. They locked, stiff as iron, holding her upright. Her breath started coming in short, shallow pulls that caught in her throat. The stiff lace collar of her gown suddenly felt like it was squeezing her. She stared at the large, ornate bed, its curtains embroidered with intertwined suns and stars. A second click. The connecting door opened, and Prince Kael entered. He had removed his formal jacket and circlet. He looked younger, and more tired. He didn't look at her at first. He walked to a small table where a carafe of wine and 2 crystal glasses sat waiting. He poured the deep red liquid, the sound a gentle glug-glug in the silent room. He held out a glass to her. His knuckles, she noticed, bore a pale, crescent-shaped scar. Elara looked at the glass, then at his face. The memory of his voice, *welcome to the Union*, echoed in her ears. The image of the branded wrist flashed before her eyes. This was the man her people had feared in stories since she was a child. This was the enemy. And now, he was her husband. Her first choice. A real one. She did not take the wine. Instead, she walked past him, her satin slippers whispering on the rug. She went to the far wall, where a large tapestry map of the 2 kingdoms hung. The border between the south's golden fields and the north's grey mountains was stitched in a thread of silver. She reached out, her fingers tracing that shimmering line. Then, with a calm she didn't feel, she curled her fingers into the fabric. She took a breath, and she pulled. The sound of ripping silk filled the room, much louder than the tear in her veil. The tapestry ripped clean down the silver border, dividing the map in two. She let the two halves hang, ragged and separate. Then she finally turned to face him. He hadn't moved. He still held the two glasses of wine. He looked from the destroyed tapestry to her face. For the first time, his neutral mask shifted. Not to anger. To a faint, weary curiosity. Elara said nothing. She just waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The game was set. The piece was broken before it even began. But as she stood there, in the beautiful room that felt like a cage, she realized something. That arrow hadn't just been meant for him. It had been a message for her, too. And she was finally ready to read it. The story they'd written for her was over. Her own was about to begin. The heavy oak door of the marital chambers closed with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. Princess Elara stood in the center of the room, the grand space feeling both huge and terribly small. The fire in the hearth popped, sending a spark skittering across the stone. That tiny, frantic movement was the only thing that matched the feeling inside her chest. She could still smell the feast downstairs, roast meat and spiced wine, but up here, the air was different. It smelled of beeswax from the polished furniture, the faint, sweet scent of the midnight roses by the window, and something new, the smell of Prince Kael's travel leathers and the crisp, cold air that still clung to him, like a memory of the mountains. He placed the two glasses of wine he'd been holding onto a small table made of dark northern walnut. The crystal made a gentle asterisk clink asterisk against the wood. He didn't try to offer her one again. He just watched her, his grey eyes taking in the torn tapestry on the wall, her stiff posture, her hands clenched at her sides. Elara's breath felt trapped. It wasn't that she couldn't breathe. It was that each breath seemed to catch on the stiff lace of her gown's high collar. She inhaled through her nose, a short, sharp pull, but it didn't seem to reach her lungs. She tried again, focusing on the flickering shadows the fire made on the ceiling. Her knees, which had locked to hold her up, began to ache with the strain. She willed them not to buckle. A princess does not collapse. "This is not what I wanted," Kael said finally. His voice was quieter than it had been in the square, less like ice and more like tired stone. "What did you want?" Elara heard herself ask. Her own voice sounded strange, thin, and far away. "A peaceful border. An end to the raids that steal my kingdom's livestock and leave good farmers freezing. A chance for my sister to grow up without talk of conscription." He said it plainly, as if listing facts from a ledger. He walked to the fireplace, resting an arm on the mantel. The scar on his knuckle was pale in the firelight. This marriage was the price for that chance. For both of us. Elara unclenched her hands. Her palms were marked with 4 small, red crescents from her nails. She looked at the ruined tapestry, the two halves of the map hanging separately. Her first real act as a married woman had been an act of destruction. It felt irreversible, like pushing a boulder off a cliff. She had chosen a side, and it was her own. "That man today," she said, turning to face him. "The one with the bow. He had my father's brand. A sun warden." Kael nodded slowly. "I saw." "You weren't surprised?" It wasn't a question. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the crackling fire. Outside the window, the moon was rising over Aurelia, a silver coin in a velvet sky. Finally, he pushed away from the mantel. "Surprise is a luxury for safe people, Princess. I stopped being surprised by assassination attempts when I was 14. He walked to a traveling trunk that had been placed at the foot of the carved bed. It was plain, made of reinforced leather with iron straps, not at all like the gilded luggage of the southern court. He unlocked it with a small key from his pocket. Inside, she could see neatly folded tunics, a whetstone, a few books with worn leather covers. From beneath a grey wool cloak, he pulled out a small, flat box made of dark metal. He held it out to her. "You ripped the map. I assume you want to see what's really happening on it." Her heart, which had been hammering, gave a hard, single thud. She walked over, the thick rug muffling her steps. She took the box. It was colder and heavier than it looked. She opened the clasp. Inside were not jewels or weapons, but papers, letters, dispatches, and small, hand-drawn diagrams. The top one was a coded message, but at the bottom, in a different, looser script, was a translation. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the words. Asterisk, the incident must be undeniable. Use the Sun Warden loyalists. The blame will fall north, and the king's mourning will turn to righteous war. The treaty will burn with the palace. Asterisk. Elara's blood went cold. She shuffled to the next page. A list of names. The third one down made her stomach drop. Lord Orwyn, her father's own brother, her jovial uncle who laughed too loudly at the feast. Next to his name was a number, 50,000 gold suns. A payment. This is a plot to kill my father, she whispered. The words felt like ashes in her mouth. And frame the north for it, Kael finished. His voice was grim. That arrow today wasn't meant to kill me. It was meant to miss. It was a warning asterisk to asterisk me, from the people in your court who don't want this peace. A show of what they could do, and a promise of what's to come. The room seemed to tilt. Elara gripped the edge of the table, the grainy wood solid under her fingertips. The crossbow bolt, the branded man, the fear in the square, it all twisted, reshaping itself into a horrifying new picture. The threat wasn't coming from the silent prince beside her. It was coiled within her own home, her own family. Why show me this? She asked, looking up at him. I could be part of it. This could be a trick. Kael met her gaze. You could be. But you tore the tapestry. Someone who was part of the plot would be trying to charm me, not challenge me. He gave a small, humorless shrug. Also, your hand is trembling. Conspirators have better nerves. She looked down. Her hand, holding the damning paper, was indeed shaking. She placed the letter back in the box with care, as if it were a live serpent. The weight of the crown on her head felt different now. It wasn't just heavy, it was a target. We need to tell my father. Now. And say what? Kael asked. He leaned back against the bedpost, crossing his arms. We have coded letters and suspicions. Your uncle is a beloved public figure. The Sun Wardens are your father's most trusted veterans. We would look like I was poisoning you against your own family to break the treaty. It would start the very war we are trying to stop. He was right. She knew he was right. The frustration was a hot, sharp thing in her throat. She felt trapped, caged by silks and politics and the smiling faces of traitors. She began to pace, the satin of her gown swishing with each turn. Think. She had to think. She was no longer just a bride to be traded. She was a piece on the board who had just seen the other players' hidden pieces. She had to move. She stopped pacing. The money. The payment to my uncle. It has to come from somewhere. We follow it. My tutor made me study ledgers and trade routes. Money leaves a trail, like footprints in mud. A flicker of something, not a smile, but a spark of focus, passed over Kael's face. The treasury here is too watched. It would come from outside, possibly through the free ports of Miran. Then that's where we start, Elara said. Her voice was firmer now. The fear was still there, cold in her stomach, but it was joined by something else, a clear, sharp purpose. We look for discrepancies. Unexplained shipments, sudden debts paid, new luxuries in the households of the names on that list. She walked to the writing desk by the window, pulling out a sheet of parchment and a quill. She dipped the nib in the inkwell, the black ink shimmering in the candlelight. She began writing, her script quick and efficient. We need to find someone you trust. Someone from the north who can move without raising suspicion here. I have a man, Kael said. Durham. He was a scout. He knows how to be unseen. He's in the city posing as a wool merchant. And I have someone, Elara said, thinking of the only person in the palace who had never treated her like a porcelain doll. Cora, my old arms instructor. She retired to the city guard stables. She hates politics, but she loves. Well, she loves a good mystery. and she knows every back alley in Aurelia. For the first time, they weren't a southern princess and a northern prince. They were two people, in a room, with a common problem. The space between them felt different. Not friendly, but functional. Necessary. They worked for an hour, speaking in low tones, passing papers back and forth. The fire burned lower. The moon climbed higher. Elara forgot about her uncomfortable gown, about the torn tapestry, about the grand bed that loomed in the room. There was only the next step, the next name, the next connection to trace. Finally, they had a rough plan. Durham would investigate the ports. Cora would watch the movements of the southern conspirators inside the city. They would meet again, carefully, in 3 days' time. The exhaustion hit Elara then, a wave that made her eyelids feel like lead. She looked at the bed, then at the large velvet chaise lounge near the fire. Kael followed her gaze. "You take the bed. I've slept on far worse than a chaise." She didn't argue. Her maids would be here at dawn, and the illusion of a happy union had to be maintained. She moved behind the painted silk dressing screen, struggling with the countless tiny buttons of her wedding gown. Finally, she managed, stepping out in a simple linen nightdress. Kael had already turned his back, busying himself with pulling a blanket onto the chaise. She slipped into the vast bed, the sheets cool. She lay there, staring at the canopy overhead, listening to the sounds of him settling in by the fire. The fear was still there, a low hum in her veins. But it was mixed with a new, fragile thread of, not trust, exactly, but something like it. A shared secret. A shared enemy. Just as her eyes were drifting closed, she heard a soft, shuffling sound outside their chamber door. It was the sound of a boot on stone, pausing. Then, the faint shadow of someone's feet blocked the sliver of light from the hallway torch under the door. They stood there, listening, for 5 long breaths. Then the shadow moved on. Elara's eyes flew open. She held her breath, listening to the silence. In the firelight, she saw Kael was also still, his eyes open, watching the door. He had heard it too. He turned his head on the chaise cushion, catching her gaze across the shadowy room. The unspoken question hung between them, thick as the darkness. Who else knew they were starting to put the pieces together? The game was no longer just outside the door. It was in the hallway. And they were both playing for keeps. But for the first time that night, Elara didn't feel entirely alone. The path ahead was dark and dangerous, but she had taken her first step. And sometimes, that's all you need to begin finding your way. The rain began on the 3rd night and refused to stop. It wasn't the gentle, pattering rain of a southern autumn. This was a northern rain, a cold, relentless downpour that drummed against the slate roofs of the palace for days on end, turning the gardens to mud and trapping everyone inside with their secrets. To Elara, each drop sounded like a ticking clock. 3 days had passed since she and Kael had formed their fragile alliance, and the weight of their shared secret was a constant, humming pressure behind her ribs. Their days fell into a strange, public routine. They would appear together at breakfast in the Sun Hall, a portrait of cautious diplomacy. Elara would wear southern silks, Kael in his grey and silver tunics. They spoke of neutral things, the weather, the rain, the health of the king, stable, the upcoming Harvest Moon Festival, uncertain. They were watched constantly. Elara could feel the eyes of the courtiers like pins on her skin, especially her Uncle Orwyn's. His laughter now sounded sharp, like cracking ice, to her ears. But in the hidden spaces, they worked. Cora, Elara's former instructor with arms as strong as oak branches, had agreed to help. She brought snippets of gossip from the guardhouse, talk of new, expensive wine in the servants' quarters of Lord Orwyn's wing, whispers of messengers arriving after dark with no royal seal. Kael's man, Durham, a quiet fellow with a face as forgettable as a stone, had slipped away to the port city of Miran. He hadn't returned. The waiting was a kind of agony. Elara took to wandering the palace's long, drafty portrait gallery. She would stare at the faces of her ancestors, kings and queens who had ruled in times of war and peace. She searched their painted eyes for answers, for a hint of the strength she so desperately needed. All she saw were layers of oil and varnish, stories smoothed over and simplified by time. On the 5th afternoon of reign, a summons came. Not from her father, but from the Council of Elders. They requested Prince Kael's presence, alone, in the map room. A cold trickle of unease, colder than the rain, went down Elara's spine. "It's not a request," Kael said, checking the knife he kept in his boot. "It was a simple, practical movement. It's a command. If I don't go, it shows guilt." He left, the heavy door closing behind him with a thud that seemed to shake the wet air in the room. Elara paced. She tried to read, but the letters swam on the page. She tried to embroider, but she pricked her finger, a single bead of blood welling up on the pale linen. The minutes stretched like taffy. 1 hour. Then 2. When the door finally opened again, it wasn't Kael. It was a young page, his hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. He bowed, not meeting her eyes, and held out a silver tray. On it lay a single, sealed scroll. "From the council, Your Highness," he mumbled, and fled. Her hands were steady as she broke the blue wax seal. The parchment was thick, official. The words were simple, and they hit her like physical blows. Asterisk by unanimous decision of the King's Council, and supported by credible witness, Crown Prince Kael of the Northern Reach is hereby detained for questioning regarding evidence of a conspiracy to poison King Aldrich. The evidence, including correspondence bearing the prince's seal and vials of wolfsbane found among his effects, is conclusive. The Treaty of Aurelia is suspended, pending full investigation. The world narrowed to the curling black script. Correspondence. His seal. Wolfsbane. It was a perfect frame. They had moved faster than she'd imagined. They had planted their story, and now they were making it real. She didn't remember running. The hallway was a blur of polished stone and startled faces. She shoved open the doors to the map room without knocking. The scene inside was quiet, tense. 5 elders stood around the great table. Her uncle Orwin was at its head, a look of grave concern on his face. Kael stood in the center of the room, his hands empty at his sides. 2 royal guards in gold cloaks stood close behind him. On the table, she saw the evidence, a small, elegant silver vial and a letter next to a broken seal that did, indeed, look like Kael's wolf's head crest. All eyes turned to her. Her uncle's face shifted into an expression of pity. "Elara, my dear child, you should not be here. This is a painful business. Where is this credible witness?" Elara demanded, her voice clear and sharp in the hushed room. From the shadows near the fireplace, a figure stepped forward. Elara's breath caught. It was Nanny Laura, the woman who had sung her to sleep, who had wiped her childhood tears, who smelled of lavender and honey cakes. Her kind, wrinkled face was streaked with real tears now. She couldn't meet Elara's eyes. "I saw him, my lady," Nanny Laura whispered, her voice trembling. 2 nights past, near the king's private kitchen garden. He was burying something. I thought nothing of it until I heard the talk of poison. My loyalty is to my king, God save him. She broke into quiet sobs. It was brilliant. Who would doubt the honest, loyal Nanny? The foundation of Elara's world, the memory of her own safe childhood, was being used as a weapon. Lord Orwin spread his hands. "You see, Elara? The proof is undeniable. This northern snake was welcomed into our home, and he sought to destroy its heart. Your father's heart." He turned his gaze to Kael. "Choose, Prince. Publicly confess your plot and name any northern co-conspirators, and your execution will be swift. Deny it, and we will have the truth from you before the war begins." The word war hung in the air, fat and final. Kael looked at Elara. His face was a mask, but his eyes held no plea, no panic. They just waited. He had told her to choose. Now the choice was hers, and it was impossible. If she defended Kael, she defended her father's accused poisoner. She would be branded a traitor, her voice silenced forever. The war would come anyway, with her standing on the wrong side of the border. If she denounced him, she would be saving her own position, maybe even delaying the war. but she would be condemning an innocent man to death. She would be agreeing to the lie, and becoming part of the very sickness that was killing her kingdom from the inside. She looked at Nanny Laura's heaving shoulders. She looked at her uncle's carefully arranged face of sorrow. She looked at the silver vial glinting on the table. And then she looked into the polished brass shield that hung on the wall as decoration. In its warped surface, she saw her own reflection, a young woman in a beautiful dress, her hair perfectly arranged, her face pale with shock. She didn't see a princess or a queen. She didn't see a diplomat or a peacemaker. She saw a pawn who had believed her crown gave her power. A girl who had been so busy looking for the enemy in the foreign prince, she had missed the rot in her own garden. The reflection showed her who she really was in that moment, utterly, terribly powerless. The silence stretched. The rain hammered on the window. Her uncle cleared his throat. Elara, the kingdom needs to see your loyalty. Your father needs to know his daughter stands with him. She opened her mouth. No sound came out. Her throat was too tight. This was the choice that broke you. There was no right path, only broken pieces. Kael spoke then, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the still room. Choose, or they choose for us. It was the final push. The words weren't a threat. They were a reminder of the reality they had discussed in front of the fire. She was out of time. And then, as she stared at Nanny Laura's tear-stained face, a memory surfaced. It was small, but sharp. A summer day, years ago. Nanny Laura, scolding a young kitchen maid for picking moonflowers. Never bring those inside, girl. Their scent is sweet, but the pollen is a slow poison. We only use them for the royal gardens because the king loves the color, and the gardeners know to be careful. Moonflowers. Her father's favorite. The same pollen that could be distilled into a poison like wolfsbane. Nanny Laura knew her plants. She knew poisons. And she had just testified, under the eyes of God and the council, that her loyalty was to the king. Elara's blood, which had felt like ice, suddenly sparked with a new, ferocious heat. She looked from Nanny Laura's downcast face to her uncle's expectant one. The pieces she had been trying to force together snapped into a new, horrifying shape. Her voice, when it finally came, was not loud. But it was solid as stone. You are correct, uncle. My loyalty is to my father, and I choose to believe the testimony of a trusted member of this household. A faint, satisfied smile touched Lord Orwyn's lips. Kael's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Elara took a step forward, pointing not at Kael, but directly at the weeping Nanny. I believe Nanny Laura is loyal to the king. So loyal, in fact, that she would never, ever mistake a patch of common nightshade for wolfsbane. And she would know that moonflower pollen, which grows only in my father's private garden, can be made into a poison that mimics it. She turned her gaze to her uncle, locking onto his suddenly still eyes. Which makes me wonder, uncle, why did your evidence include wolfsbane, when the witness you produced is an expert who would have suggested something else, something untraceable from our own gardens? The room went dead silent. Nanny Laura's sobs cut off abruptly. The color drained from Lord Orwyn's face. The other elders shifted, their eyes flicking between the vial, the nanny, and Orwyn with dawning suspicion. Elara's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples. She had thrown a stone into the still pond. Now she had to watch the ripples. And then Elara realized the truth she had been clinging to was a lie. She had believed this was a fight between North and South. But it wasn't. It was a fight between those who wanted peace and those who profited from war. And her own family, the people she had trusted most, was standing on the wrong side. The game had just changed completely. And for the first time, she wasn't a pawn on the board. She was the hand that had just tipped it over. The path ahead was darker than ever, but she could finally see who her real enemies were. And sometimes, knowing the truth, even a painful one, is the first step toward finding the light. The silence in the map room was so complete Elara could hear the asterisk drip 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 asterisk of rainwater from a leak in the far corner. The sound was steady, marking the seconds as everyone processed what she had just said. Her uncle, Lord Orwyn, looked as if he'd been struck. His mouth opened, then closed, his carefully crafted mask of concern crumbling into something raw and ugly. Nanny Laura had stopped crying, her face now pale with a different kind of fear. Elara didn't wait for them to recover. Her heart was a wild drum in her chest, but her mind had never felt clearer. Her old flaw, seeing only the threat in the stranger, the enemy in the foreign face, had blinded her for too long. Now, she turned that guarded heart into a weapon. She would trust no one. She would suspect everyone. And in this room full of lies, that made her the most dangerous person here. "Guards," she said, her voice not rising, but carrying a tone of command she had learned from her father. The two gold-cloaked soldiers behind Kael shifted, confused. They looked to the elders, then to Lord Orwyn. "You serve the crown," Elara continued, stepping forward. "The crown is my father, who lies ill, and I am his named heir. Secure that vial. Do not let it leave this room." One of the guards, a young man with an honest, open face, moved first. He carefully picked up the small silver container, holding it away from his body. The other guard stood straighter, his hand moving away from Kael's arm. "This is preposterous." Lord Orwyn spluttered, finding his voice. He pointed a trembling finger at Elara. "The girl is confused. She is defending her husband out of a misplaced sense of duty, twisting the words of a faithful servant." "Then we shall have the royal physician, Master Gillen, test the substance immediately," Elara said, not taking her eyes off her uncle. "In front of all of us. And we shall send for the head gardener, old Thomas, to tell us what has been planted in the king's private plot this season. The truth is easy to find, uncle, when you stop shouting over it." The other elders, for old men who had advised her father for decades, began to murmur among themselves. They were slow, cautious men who loved tradition and hated scandal. A public investigation was the last thing they wanted. One of them, Elder Bren, cleared his throat. "Princess, perhaps this is a matter for private discussion. The accusations are grave." "The life of my father, your king, is grave," Elara interrupted, turning her gaze on him. "The peace between two kingdoms, which thousands of good people have prayed for, is grave. We will have the truth here, now, in the light. Or do you have something to fear from the light, Elder Bren?" The old man recoiled as if she'd thrown water on him. She was using their own tools, protocol, honor, public scrutiny, against them. It was a gamble, but it was the only move she had. In the tense quiet that followed, Kael finally spoke. He hadn't moved from his spot in the center of the room. "There is also the witness, Durnham, my wool merchant," he said, his voice calm. "He returned from Miran an hour ago. He is waiting outside with the portmaster's ledgers. They show a ship, the Silver Eel *, making a deposit of 50,000 gold suns into a private vault. The vault is registered to a shell company. The company's paperwork was signed by a man with a signet ring. The wax impression matches Lord Orwyn's personal seal." It was the final, devastating blow. Orwyn's face went from red to a sickly grey. He looked from Elara to Kael, understanding dawning in his eyes. They had not been waiting passively. They had been working in the shadows, gathering their own stones for the sling. You allied with him? Against your own blood." Orwyn whispered, the betrayal in his voice real and sharp. Elara met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt no guilt, only a cold, clean certainty. "I allied with the truth, uncle, and you are up to your elbows in lies." The doors burst open then, not with violence, but with purpose. Cora, Elara's old instructor, marched in. Her guard's uniform was damp from the rain, and her grey hair was escaping its braid. She was followed by a nervous-looking man in a harbour master's cap, clutching a large leather-bound book, and Kael's man, Durnham, whose expression was as flat as ever. The room was now very crowded. "Got your messages," Cora said to Elara, her eyes scanning the scene and missing nothing. She gave a sharp, satisfied nod. "The pieces fit. The money, the poison, the planted evidence. It's a tidy little box of treason." What followed was not a battle of swords, but a battle of paper and ink. The portmaster's ledger was opened on the great map table. The physician was summoned and, under the watchful eyes of everyone, began a preliminary test on the vial's contents. Old Thomas the gardener arrived, smelling of wet earth, and confirmed the moonflowers were only grown in one place. The evidence built, brick by brick, into a wall around Lord Orwyn and the weeping Nanny Laura, who finally confessed he had threatened her grandson if she did not play her part. Through it all, Elara stood shoulder to shoulder with Kael, not as a princess and a prince from hostile lands, but as partners who had uncovered a plot to destroy everything they were trying to build. They didn't need to speak. A glance, a slight shift in stance, was enough. The connection between them was no longer a fragile thread of necessity. It was a rope, strong and braided from shared danger and a common purpose. As the winter sun, weak and pale, finally broke through the rain clouds outside, the truth was laid bare for all to see. Lord Orwyn was led away by the guards, his head bowed, all his bluster gone. The elders, shaken and ashamed, began drafting a statement to the court, their pens scratching frantically on parchment. Elara felt a deep, bone-aching tiredness, but beneath it was a new feeling, a steady warmth like the first ember of a fire. She looked at Kael. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a shared exhaustion, and something else, a respect that hadn't been there before. The formal confrontation was over, but the real work was just beginning. They had exposed the rot, but the kingdom was still sick with suspicion. Her father was still weak in his chambers. The people were still afraid. Cora approached, handing Elara a cloak. "You'll catch a chill," she grunted, her way of showing care. "The square is filling up. Word travels fast. They've heard about the arrest. They're scared, and they're angry. They need to see you. Both of you." Elara understood. The private battle was won. Now came the public one. The story of the treacherous northern prince would already be spreading through the taverns and market stalls. They had to rewrite that story, together, before it hardened into a new truth. She nodded, swinging the warm wool cloak over her shoulders. Kael did the same, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the doors leading to the main balcony, the one overlooking the coronation square where this had all begun. The murmur of the crowd was a low roar from the other side of the heavy doors, a sound of confusion and unrest. Elara's palms were damp. She glanced at Kael. He offered a single, short nod. It was enough. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, the weight of the future they were about to step into. The path of peace was not a smooth garden path. It was a road they would have to build themselves, stone by stone, in front of everyone. She reached for the iron door handle. It was cold in her grip. And then, together, they pushed the doors open and stepped out into the light. 5 years later, on a morning in early autumn, the training yard was alive with the sound of laughter and the friendly clatter of wooden swords. The old oak post, scarred and solid, stood in the same spot it had for 100 years. Princess Elara, now Queen Elara of the United Realm, rested her hand against its familiar rough bark. Her fingers traced the deep, dark gash left by a crossbow bolt, a wound in the wood that had long since healed over into a smooth, knotted whorl. The memory was there, but it no longer held the sharp sting of fear. It felt like a lesson, carved in tree flesh. She watched her son, 2-year-old Prince Alan, as he toddled with fierce concentration near the base of the post. His chubby hands were trying to stack smooth river stones into a wobbly tower. He wore a tiny tunic that was a blend of southern gold and northern grey, stitched together by her own hand. The sun, warm but gentle, painted his light brown hair with streaks of gold. "Boom," Alan said suddenly, pointing a sticky finger at the scar on the post. He looked up at his mother, his eyes the same clear grey as his father's, but sparkling with a curiosity that was all his own. Elara smiled. "A long time ago, yes. A big noise. But it's quiet now." The peace was not a perfect, silent thing. It was a busy, sometimes messy, often loud kind of peace. The United Kingdom, now called the Sun and Stone Realm, had faced its struggles. There had been stubborn disputes over land rights, grumbling from old soldiers on both sides, and 2 years of poor harvests that tested everyone's patience. But the war, the deep, generational hatred, had not returned. The border fortresses were being taken down, their stones used to build new roads and bridges. The door from the keep opened, and King Kael walked into the yard. He moved differently now. The rigid, watchful stiffness was gone, replaced by an easy stride. He carried 2 cups of steaming cider, the scent of apples and cinnamon cutting through the clean morning air. He handed one to Elara, his fingers brushing hers. The simple silver band he wore, woven to look like a sun ray crossing a mountain peak, matched the one on her own hand. "The council meeting finished early," he said, his voice relaxed. "The tax agreement for the Eastern will trade is finally settled." Everyone only shouted a little bit. A faint smile touched his eyes as he watched Arlen abandon his stone tower to chase a bright orange leaf skittering across the flagstones. "A miracle," Elara replied, taking a sip of the warm, sweet cider. It tasted like safety, like home. Kael leaned against the post beside her, his shoulder comfortably close to hers. He looked at the old scar, then out at their son, then back at her. Without a word, he pulled something from the pocket of his simple leather jacket. It was a single arrow, but its steel head was rounded and blunt, polished to a dull shine. It was useless for harm. It was just an object, heavy with meaning. He placed it gently into her open palm. She closed her fingers around the smooth, cool wood of the shaft. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a promise kept, a reminder of what they had stopped and what they had built instead. Arlen came running back, his little legs pumping. He wrapped his arms around his father's knee, then looked up at the arrow in his mother's hand with wide eyes. "Stick?" he asked. "A reminder," Elara said softly. "A heavy one," Kael added, his gaze meeting hers. There was no sadness in it, only a shared understanding. The past had weight. You didn't forget it. You carried it together, and that made it lighter. Later that afternoon, they walked through the Coronation Square, now simply called Unity Square. The same sandstone walls rose around them, but the banners that flew were new. On one flag, a golden sun cradled a grey mountain. On another, a mountain peak held the sun in its crest. The fountain where the assassin had once stood now had a basin where children could sail little boats. An old southern musician and a young northern drummer were playing a lively, mixed tune together, drawing a smiling crowd. They weren't followed by a ring of nervous guards anymore. A few watchful soldiers, a mixed unit, walked a respectful distance away. Trust was a plant that grew slowly, but its roots were deep here now. That evening, after Arlen was asleep in his bed, a carved wooden wolf from the north and a stuffed cloth lion from the south tucked under each arm, Elara and Kael walked up to the palace's high watchtower. It was a habit they'd formed in the first year, a quiet moment to look at what they were protecting. The lights of the city of Aurelia twinkled below, stretching further north than they used to, into what had once been a separate kingdom. The air was cool and smelt of wood smoke and baking bread. Elara leaned on the stone parapet, the same blunt arrow now sitting in a simple holder on the wall of the tower, beside a spyglass and a vase of wildflowers. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" she asked quietly, the words barely louder than the breeze. "If we had chosen differently on any of those days?" Kael was silent for a moment, looking out at the sea of lights. "Every day," he said finally. "And then I hear Arlen laugh, or I see a merchant from my mountains arguing fairly with one of your valley farmers in the market, or I taste cider that's made from both our apples, and I know the choice was right." He took her hand, his thumb running over the silver band on her finger. There were no grand speeches, no declarations, just the solid, warm pressure of his hand in hers, and the shared view of a kingdom at peace, night settling over it like a soft blanket. The scar on the oak post in the yard was permanent. It would be there for the life of the tree, a part of its story. But around it, the yard was full of life. The scuff marks of training boots, the little pile of river stones, the sweet smell of fallen leaves. The wound hadn't disappeared. It had simply become the place where new growth started from. And as they stood there together, watching over their quiet, bustling, imperfect, and beautiful world, That was enough. More than enough. It was